It's called module 2, but I'll just hide that to avoid confusion. Maybe I should get the actual. One moment. This is what I gave you. Okay. So the growth of knowledge in the modern world and the the decades or the centuries leading up to it is closely linked with our ability to measure what we are studying. Okay, so growth of knowledge, that's much more empirical, like looking at what is, gathering information, looking for patterns, right? So I focus the beginning on actually collecting data. So that then once you have data sets after this unit or module, you'll be able to think about just focusing on how to analyze them as opposed to how good they are, right? So we'll have a better sense of how good data is and what the assumptions are about data. So we're going to talk about good data and bad data. So measuring things is a real issue. In experimental trials, you learn that the golden or the gold standard, let's say, the gold standard for trials, for clinical trials that are experimental, is the randomized controlled trial. And this is because it's been observed in reality that when people are observed, they may change their behavior. And their behavior change can be visible, and then it can be kind of invisible, right? So in the video, they mentioned somebody being observed in an experiment may change their actual behavior. So if they're being watched, let's say, to look at their health outcomes given a treatment. So let's say, let's talk about the physician study where they were studying the effectiveness of aspirin in reducing the chance of death from heart attack. The idea was, well, what if they, just because they're being observed every few months, they're coming in, they're doing a physical, they might start working out because they don't want to fail the test. So these are physicians that were part of the study, and maybe they're overachievers and they want to really get in shape. So you don't want that fact to confound the result that the impact of the treatment, right? We don't want it to impact or change the understanding that their outcome has to do with the treatment. We want the results to be controlled to telling us that this was the treatment impact. So that is known as the Hawthorne effect, and it's not explained explicitly in the video, but I just make a note here. Then there's the placebo effect. The placebo effect has been noticed where patients or participants in a study, the very fact that they're in the study gives them hope, let's say, possibly. I think that's the best word to captivate it or capture it, is that the very fact that they're part of the study gives them some sense of relief, maybe de-stresses them. And the results are actually biochemical. You don't see it on the surface. You don't see them doing different things, but inside their body is going through a greater healing process or a deoxidative process or whatever processes. The very positive feelings can have a positive impact on their health. And so you also, as great as that is, and as great as both of these are, you don't want them to artificially influence the outcome. So what we do is we create two groups of participants, and you randomize between those two groups. You have what you call, we'll talk about randomization shortly. So this is for the treatment group. These people actually get the treatment, and the control group. I'm not spelling words. I should spell the whole word. Group. Okay. So I can use the symbol TX, treatment. It's common. So then what I do is I look at the results at the end of the study, and I record let's look at the control group first. Let's say 40% of the control group say they feel great. They feel much better. And even in blood samples, it looks like their results have improved. To attribute improvements to the treatment, the pill or the exercise regime or whatever it is that is being studied, that has been narrowed down to a very specific thing that can be observed and controlled. What we do is make sure that the treatment group does much better. So let's say 50% do better, feel better. So this differential here is what we need to study. Is that enough? Is this differential enough to say, aha, there's a significant improvement? I'm gonna draw it like this. That is what we are going to, that's where I'm going to get you. Okay, I'm going to get you to the end of this course where we start measuring that. Now, is 10% good enough to say this drug has a significant, statistically significant impact? We're looking for statistical significance. That will be the end of the course. I'll just introduce it now as our meta, our goal. Now, some problems have arisen because of the internet in the last 30 years, because of the internet and the spread of information. People that otherwise wouldn't have that information, who were suffering sort of in isolation, if they were they are fortunate their doctor may be interested in having them participate in a trial to see if it will resolve either their migraine issues or alleviate their concerns about symptoms of menopause or different kinds of ailments. The fact that they had to just rely on being offered participation in a trial is very different than today, where people read about developments, they read about other trials that have been going on. They get the information from news, or they join groups or sites of people who are common sufferers who are in trials. So this information spreads so rapidly that it builds a kind of a frenzy, and people want to participate. People who are really suffering either may move to participate in a trial, cancer sufferers and such. So what is that? There's a lot of anticipation that those trials will have a positive impact. And what's that going to affect? Can someone tell me how that changes things? How will that change? How does that change this paradigm? I was talking about their hope, right? Hope is over here. So the fact that there might be something to alleviate their problems, and that information spreading, and positive news maybe being relied on a lot more. The placebo effect, so this is what this is called. Well, this effect here that shouldn't exist. This is partly because they didn't get the treatment. This is partly just maybe people resolving their issues over time, because they learned how to deal with them. It's partly placebo effect. It's partly maybe they've changed their behaviors, and it's a Hawthorne effect. What's going to happen is that, and it's been observed, that this ends up much higher. I'm trying to get a different color. Now what happens? If it's up there, what's wrong with that? Well, if it doesn't also happen in the treatment group,
yeah, it would be hard to justify the treatment has any statistical significance,
and it doesn't happen substantially, you're going to have a problem, because the drug will have to do even better overall. So you have to hope that this impact is equally affecting the treatment group. Otherwise, you're going to see, and I've seen it before because I've reviewed trial results, that you have placebo effect where 60% of people claim they are improved. Oh, I can't hear you. So let me see what's wrong with me. It's so silent. Not hear you. I'm going to take out my headphones. That might help. Might be confusing my computer. Oh, I know, because I turned this off yesterday, that's why. Okay, go ahead now, tell me. Am I interrupting you? Try that. Is somebody there?
Can you hear us now?
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead. Oh, you were answering my question, so that's good. All right, any comments about what I had to say? So the placebo effect of about 60% improved has been observed. In many trials. And since people in the control group don't know they're in the control group, it should be just as likely in the treatment group, but random chance might have it that this is not matched in the treatment group. All right, so I find it interesting that during the COVID vaccine rollout, there wasn't a consideration for the placebo effect, ironically. I mean, they built the placebo effect into the trials. They had a control group, they had a treatment group. Unfortunately, after 2 months of looking at the treatment group or and the control group and studying them in follow-up, they unblinded, it calls it, because it was a double-blind trial that where the participant and the researcher didn't know who was in either group. It's all that the codes used for identifying participants needs to be unblinded, so you know who falls in which group. But the unblinding was done just after 2 months, so there's no long-term trials for the COVID vaccine. That was unfortunate. The other unfortunate thing is that there's no consideration for the placebo effect after they rolled out the vaccine and forced people to take it, because there's a placebo effect, but there's also something called the nocebo effect. Like people taking treatment may react poorly to the treatment if they don't want it or they have some apprehension about it. So that's not being studied in any kind of formal, systematic way. So that's unfortunate. That's a really lost opportunity for the sake of just rolling things out on such a grand scale. So anyway, I thought I'd mention that. Any comments?
So, Professor, I have a doubt. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the placebo effect, the nocebo effect, and the Hawthorne effect are like characteristics that could affect the information, both the control and the treatment group, right?
Yes, exactly. It could be even, it could be uneven. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe the case of the COVID was that the government was pressuring, so they could release the vaccines on time.
No, I
So
get it, but no one thought about the adverse effect of doing that when we know that this happens. In fact, we prepare trials to control against placebo. I think their effort to to prevent the nocebo effect was telling everybody that it's so important and it's safe and effective, and just continuing to bombard everybody with information. Like that was their attempt to avoid any of this happening. You know, giving something to someone that doesn't want it is not, it's just not good. You know, it's just not it's just not a good, and no one talks about it. I'm not going to say I read about it, because I haven't read about it. I just thought about it, that this should have been considered, but they didn't want to consider it, because if they considered it, then it might have caused it, right? The human mind, if they started conversations or panels talking about, oh, forcing people might make them feel nervous and make them sick and give them stomach aches, or you know, make them inflamed, because that's the problem, was the inflammation in the arm, people fainted. I mean, that could have been all stress related, but we'll never know until the proper studies are done. All right. Anyway, we lost an opportunity, because now there's so much different information out there. All right. So then you're taught about the difference between observational studies and experimental studies. So in general, what's the difference? If someone wants to tell me.
In experiment, you manipulate one of the groups. In observation, you just determine a conclusion based on what you see over the course of time.
Right.
And in observation, you don't.
Right. Good. And you cannot attribute any causal effects in observation studies until you do an experiment. That's another way to link them, right? So that's a great explanation. So experiments, you actually do something to the treatment group, and you do nothing to the experimental group in terms of the treatment, but otherwise you have the treatment and the control group treated the same, like that, not treated, but I mean, they don't know, and neither do the researchers know in a double-blind controlled trial. Now, there's all kinds of trials. They're not all double-blind. Sometimes the researcher knows if it's something. Actually, I think that the COVID, I think I read that it was not double-blind, because in case anything happened, the researcher needed to know, something like that. Okay, anyway, it could be, anyway, at any rate, it can be that a trial is not double-blind, but for a reason, because it's so new, something so new, the researcher needs to know, or the experimental, the nurse that's injecting would need to know.
Professor, do you think that's why the vaccines came out like in batches, and the batches had numbers just to make sure if maybe it was the batch and have more control over the...
Well, they probably had to do that anyways, but for manufacturing reasons and I guess, safety and follow up and all that, but that probably has to happen for manufacturing. But do you mean because they want to follow up people in general with like who got it and who didn't get it?
Yeah, for example, I got a call from the CDC.
Oh, yeah. See, they need to track. Yeah, that's good. That's good. And yeah, they that way they can say if something was wrong disproportionately with reactions to one batch, they can contact everybody. So that's good. Some people were, I don't know, at the beginning, there's a lot of information. There were a lot of speculations that they were actually studying people without anybody knowing, but that's completely illegal. They can't do that. But I won't put it past them if they did it, because again, under emergency orders, it looks like they can do almost anything. So I was very apprehensive, and I was not satisfied. I'll just tell you personally, I was not satisfied with any of the information out there. So I did not get vaccinated, because I just said there's not enough information and I have enough health issues. I actually moved to Puerto Rico because of health reasons. I'm not going to take this thing. And I mean, I didn't have to go to school. It didn't make any sense because I didn't have to see anybody really. So that's how I handled it. But I know it's unfortunately other people didn't have any luxury like that. But I had more severe reasons, and I was supported by I was supported by the medical establishment that I didn't have to get it. So, all right, so back to this. So observational studies. So, okay, so linking these two before we go on about talking about them separately. So if you see something in observation, you want to create experimental conditions to test whether in fact what you think might have a causal effect. So in the video you saw, they wanted to see the effect of blurring the vision of a lobster and seeing how he changes his behavior. That was a very controlled experiment. Probably did it on several lobsters for replication purposes, and to see that they found something causal, right? But just observing the lobster wouldn't be information enough. So what you see in observation can be translated into experiment, but sometimes it can't. Sometimes you cannot translate what you see or observe into an actual experiment. And the example of that would be the case of smoking causing cancer. An actual experiment was never conducted on humans to see if smoking causes cancer, because there's already enough evidence, convincing evidence, that there was a link, and to force people to take in cigarette smoke just to be part of a double-blind controlled trial was considered unethical. So it wasn't done. And that left a lot in terms of the video. It explains that left a lot of room for the tobacco industry to exploit the very fact that there were no experiments done to prove it. And then anecdotal evidence can be used to say, oh, I know an 80-year-old man who smokes every day, or I know a chain-smoking 89-year-old woman and she's just fine. And that's not experimental, right? That's anecdotal, and really you want to construct experiments to control and see what exactly is the effect of smoking. Okay. So in many ways, science theory is, so people call theory, until an experiment is done to establish a causal link. Statistics is a tool that helps measurement through survey analysis or experimentation to produce knowledge and clear up confusion. Statistics is concerned with producing new data as well as with interpreting already available data. Produced data for statistical analysis can either can be for the purpose of an observation or exploratory study as collected through sampling, or for an experiment. And both of those have to be carefully designed, right? So this is the definition of an experiment, and some examples in the video of experiments. What were some examples of experiments in the video? I already explained the physician health study. And I have this in my annotated notes as well. What was another experiment that we saw in the video? They did tar on rats to test for cancer. Other experiments? And give me some examples of observational studies that were covered in the video for the people who watched it or watched them.
There was one with the lobsters, a marine biologist that were studying the comportamiento de los lobsters,
Yeah.
the behavior.
Observation.
Yeah, that they compete for their lair or the shells where they're hidden.
Lobsters. They also did There were surveys, there was the labor survey by the NORC. They're going around and asking people about their work, how much they work, right? Other observational studies. There was the census of the homeless. Trying to count the homeless. Or census and the attempt to count the homeless. All right. So there are two main types. So that's just some of them, but there are more discussed. I'll just leave it like that. And you can see the annotated notes where I make some points. There are two types of observational studies mentioned in the video. What are the two types? One that uses data from the past, and the other one that studies subjects for a number of years from the start of the study.
Retrospective and prospective.
Right. The idea of this exercise is just to get you to try and remember the video, because the video in whole is the most important. That's what I want you to take away, those images, and it's much more memorable than just reading notes, in my opinion. Oh, what happened to my pages? Didn't realize I had an extra page. Okay. I have to fix that. Okay, so then I introduce a concept that's not in the video, bias. It's discussed, but not the way I'm discussing it. So a survey or experimental design is biased if it systematically favors certain outcomes. A finding is biased upward if the result is more, greater, higher than is actually the case. An example in the video of a result that's been biased upward would be what?
The case of the election.
So the election, right? The presidential election.
Yeah, that those very few people had access to, only the rich, they say in the video. The one with access to the telephones and cars.
Right. So the election polls favored the Republican voters. I don't know if that they said it like that, but I'll say because it was a Republican versus a Democrat, no? Roosevelt and Landon. So Landon supporters I'll just say phone. So they had access to phones to be contacted. And they were on lists for car sales. So they were easy to contact. So you got to think about the source, right? You have to think about how are they finding these people? When they do polling, some polls today, people who are polled are actually paid. And how can that influence your results if people who are being part of a poll are actually paid to be part of the poll? What kind of people or who needs that kind of money. It can't be too much. Like the amount that's offered either for experiments or for surveys, the compensation cannot be too much because you don't want to influence who actually shows up. But you have to think about how that does affect things and the amount. So there's also so this favored Landon. It was biased towards people who had access to phones. So people who were richer in that case. They were trying to make the point. And then there was the voluntary response survey of Ann Landers. I hope you can read my printing. I'm trying to be neat. It's hard. Ann Landers' voluntary response survey asking people, would they have kids again? What happened there?
Most of them said no because only the people that didn't want kids answered the
survey.
survey.
Or the question. Yeah, exactly. So it was getting people who wanted to express themselves, were really triggered by the question, that they wanted to respond to the question, and it disproportionately attracted disgruntled people who wanted to express their dissatisfaction with being parents or having kids. So that can happen. There's no control and people can call at will. So you got to be careful. So this creates sensational results. In the end, you get sensational results when you ask a question that does trigger the population, and sensational results make headlines. They get more viewers. So you can't really rely on most of, I'm going to say that's a strong word, most, but you can't rely on what you see in the media on face value. It's entertaining, it's interesting. You have to go to the source, right? You have to know how to dig up, how did they collect these people? Where, like, for instance, when Trump ran for election in 2016, it was like a shock because all the polls were showing that he was so behind in the polls. Well, obviously the polls were biased. They were biased against him, right? They were downward bias in this case against Trump because in fact he won. He just shocked everybody with the win. So and there's so much sensationalization in elections. It's really hard to know who to trust, and it's so polarized now too. So it's I just watch the news honestly like entertainment. It's just entertainment. To get to know what's really going on is a whole other thing. Especially when it comes to politics. All right, so there's some more examples, but let's move on. So downward bias in the video. When did you see that there were examples that the results were lesser than they should have been, or lower or smaller than they should have been? So just a more basic example in survey was the census, right? The census undercounts. We miss people. It's biased downward, and it's not biased upward, which is interesting. It's biased downward. So they're careful not to include people that shouldn't be there, but they in fact are undercounting. Okay, any other examples you want to mention? Or some students are just confused between these two, but basically, yeah, it's just what it's here. So census is an undercount that's biased downward. The number looks artificially low. Trump, well, that's not in the video, but Trump's election chances were biased downward by the polls and the media. in 2016. Okay, so how did data get produced? Are you guys commenting? Yeah, I see that now. Thank you. I wasn't reading the chat. So Patricia says 70% said no about kids, right? And then Marla said that minorities in the census were being undercounted. So yeah, maybe I write that. So I was more general, but she's more specific. And I'm sure, I mean, this video is 30 years old, but I'm sure it's still the case. So many adjustments are made, like statistical adjustments are made to, and it is controversial, but to adjust for the undercount. All right, let's talk again about experiments and collecting data. Experimentation is conducted to develop evidence to support a causal link between an explanatory and response variable. So a little more terminology for you. So an explanatory variable is the thing, the characteristic that explains the outcome or response. Conducting a good experiment controls for the effect of influential factors other than your explanatory variable to establish a clear relationship between explanatory and response. Key points, the idea is to intervene with or treat a subject and measure how it or she or he responds. This arises more frequently in the physical pure sciences than in the social sciences. You can control better, right? If you're controlling a molecule or you're giving somebody a pill, but let's say you're putting somebody on a diet. This is, I don't know if you're familiar, you recognize that when you hear results about food or nutrition from year to year to year, seems to change. So I think experimental studies with nutrition are very difficult. First of all, like how do you confirm compliance? And then there's what about what other people, the other things that people are eating. You have to really control what they're eating to make sure that it's the influence of that one thing that you want to study. So those are really challenging type studies, and you see in the results that there's a lot of variance. They'll tell you eggs are bad for you, then eggs are good for you, then the yolk is bad for you, then the white is bad for you, or having them together is good. So it kind of comes full circle that you got to just eat the egg. But the quality of the egg is another thing too, is how it was. It's not just about the egg, it's how it was produced and the conditions under which it's produced. So yeah, agricultural research and nutritional research both are difficult to devise experiments, and we'll talk more about agriculture later. So it's also difficult to create experiments for managerial sciences. Marketing, they've become better at it in marketing. And what about insurance? In the 1970s, the Rand Corporation conducted a massive study that still is referenced today about the impact of health insurance on health outcomes and income. And I'm trying to explore at a time where the rest of the Western world was exploring the idea of universal coverage, how that would influence the public. And the study has never been repeated since, because the experiment is difficult to create. How do you, so they temporarily give people money for healthcare and in different amounts and different groups and monitor them. Well, how long can you keep that sort of thing going before you influence behaviors and change the controlled setting? So there's a really hard studies to
to control. Are any of you watching the Netflix? Okay, I mean, the only reason I watch this is because of, again, entertainment. My family was watching this when I was visiting them in Canada. It's called Love is Blind. So that's an experiment. Love is Blind is an experiment, right? You see the effect of having people meet each other in a short time. And they don't get to see each other, but they get to know each other in these controlled circumstances. And in the end, after 2 weeks, they decide who they want to propose marriage to. So anyway, without getting into the issues there, what are the possible confounding factors with that experiment? Is that a good experiment? Is that a bad experiment? We can think about it, and maybe we'll talk about it a little more later. I'm not sure. Anybody watching that? It's not like
Yeah, I am,
you're
sadly.
guilty. You're guilty.
Yeah. I'm ashamed, but yes.
Don't be ashamed, because it's and it's entertainment, and then, it's pretty clean. It's not like The Bachelor or anything. It's quite clean. They make it pretty innocent. Well, maybe not. They don't show scenes or anything, but it's pretty clean, I think, relatively speaking to what you can see. Okay, so we could talk about the quality of that experiment. That's interesting, but no, let's move on. So actually conducting the experiment is important. Okay, so that's the thing, right? So they have these people meeting each other in experimental conditions, but then what they do is they release them after 2 weeks back to where they come from, like their hometown. And most of the couples are from nearby towns, so that they can even hang out and get together and support each other through the transition to the real world. And you see if the experimental conditions are irrelevant, right? Do they still stay together? Do the couples remain together, or do they break up? I'm convinced that Paul was paid off to not marry Mika at the end, because for people who don't watch the series, because they had to have some drama, because all the couples worked out. So the main confounding factor in Love is Blind experiment is that they want to be famous. And to be famous, you have to have a successful relationship and then marriage to continue to be famous, right? So I think that's a huge confounding factor. I'll just say it like that, of Love is Blind as an experiment. It can be entertaining for some, not entertaining for others, but as an experiment, it's confounded by the fact that people just want to be famous, and they'll say, oh yeah, I'm in love, and just act their way through. The character or the personality, Irina, was guilty or accused of wanting to be famous, and for her behaviors on the show. Okay, so actually conducting the experiment is important. If you don't, and instead rely on other information that looks good, you can run into problems. When the experiment is not pure, responses can be confounded, confused by lurking or overlooked variables, which may play a role. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about hormone replacement therapy. So HRT, since I don't know, maybe I guess I can't put a year on it, but since the internet, let's say, so it became much more popular that women suffering through menopause that could hit as early as the 40s into the 50s, they may suffer because of hormonal shifts, and women have to manage 3 sex hormones. Men only have to really worry about the one, testosterone, but women have to manage estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, and if the balance is out, the symptoms can be debilitating, really. So what had happened in the 90s with the raise, the information age, women were finding out that they didn't have to suffer because they could get hormone replacement therapy. So I'm saying just that woman who otherwise wouldn't know about this possibility caught wind of it, and she would mention it, her symptoms to her doctor and find out that, maybe she doesn't have to go through this. And the problem with women is a loss of estrogen. So the recommendation would be to take some estrogen and maybe some dose of the other sex hormones. So women were opting in to get hormone replacement therapy, and there were some treatment guidelines that were developed in the medical establishment to treat women. However, there was never a proper experiment conducted for decades. So when it was finally conducted, within a few years, it was found that bringing in to the studies just women who wanted to try it, but otherwise weren't taking it, had demonstrated that there were risks. There are risks to taking synthetic estrogen or the other hormones. You can get more natural source of these hormones. They're more expensive. So being part of a trial, anyway, whatever was shared with them or given through the trial, the results showed after a short time that women were developing cancer and problems with bone density, I believe. So anyway, there were adverse effects. So how can you explain that? How can you explain that without the experiment, things looked really great and treatment was it was shared among doctors in the medical community and doctors were prescribing, but then it just had to stop. They pulled back and they said, you have to at least monitor patients and you shouldn't be giving it just to anyone. It has to be with certain guidelines and certain monitoring to make sure that they don't have any adverse events or adverse effects. So what the problem was, it's been proposed, is that women who were asking for the treatment, who were knowledgeable enough and had the means to afford the treatment, were probably otherwise in all their other in their lifestyle and in their in their demographic, they were a certain young age, they were had a good education, had leisure time, so they had a lot of factors that are considered positive they had the ability to reduce the risk factors for any adverse events. Okay, so they had money to have a good diet, they were physically active, they had low stress, they had all these factors that could reduce the chance of poor health outcomes were demonstrated in the observational studies, just watching people who were just taking it and could afford to take it. But when they introduced everybody to the trials, the average person didn't do so well, right? And actually had adverse events. So they had to stop the trials and they rolled back and warned physicians about hormone replacement therapy in general. Okay, so then the last point, experimental design must be careful not to introduce bias. Just a last point. So with all those things I was mentioning, other variables were confounding, right? They're confounding variables. The reasons why patients were doing well with hormone replacement therapy and not having those adverse events reported was because of other factors that were protecting them from not having those adverse events. They had the money, the means to see a doctor regularly, get tests, get the best kind of hormones, and such on, so on. All right, so examples of experiments from the video. If you have any others, you can put them here. You can see what I wrote. I think I wrote what did I write there? Oh, right, the theoretical experiment of the babies for, so the theoretical experiment. So it was suggested to do a proper experiment to study if smoking causes cancer. The ideal experiment would be to divide babies at birth into the treatment and control group and follow them over time in a prospective study, having the treatment group use cigarettes and the control group not use cigarettes at all, or control them or protect them from cigarettes, and see the outcomes later. That would be the ideal experiment, and that would help. If you had a large enough study, you could, or large enough number of participants, you could rule out any kind of genetic link to being preventative against getting cancer. All right. Okay, what are two key differences between designing surveys and designing experiments? So one is that you impose a treatment. Well, you said that from the beginning. In an observational study, subjects are not manipulated in any way. That's one. The second point I want to make is the randomization. When it comes to experiment, it's difficult. It's a challenge, let's say that. It's a challenge to get experimental subjects to attract people into an experiment, because everyone has only so much time in a day, and to ask them to participate with taking experimental treatment and to comply, it's difficult to take them in, and in a follow-up to follow them and ask them to come in. You're going to lose people as time goes on. So the first part, you need to screen them very well, right? They have to be screened and then randomized. And my point here is that you have, after you screen them, to make sure that they are cleared, they're not at any risk to be part of the experiment, that they look like a candidate who's going to follow through in the experiment. You might even pay for their parking, or you have somebody pick them up so they can participate in the experiment, or you might visit their home if it's a matter of measuring their vitals or blood pressure, things in a physical kind of experiment. So whoever is on your final list, you're going to use them. So you're going to use everybody. And you're going to assign them to treatment and control group. All right. In a survey, you're going to do your best to label you're going to do your best to label the population or label, yeah, you're going to do your best to label the population, and you select a sample from the population. So you don't use everybody, right? Survey uses only a sample from a labeled population. So we're going to talk more about all this stuff in a bit. Okay, questions? Talk some about lurking variable and what was said there. So you learned in the video about the phenomenon of ice cream sales being high when drownings are high. Could it be that ice cream causes people to drown? So the question is there a causal link? And the decision or the resolution or the answer was no. There's most likely no causal link. However, this is telling us something that shouldn't be ignored, right? What is it telling us? Now think of it from a managerial perspective. If you were the director of the beach, I'm not sure the titles that you would have, but somebody's in charge of the beach, right? And you were aware that this was the case. Maybe you should have more staff on the beach, more lifeguards and more staff to assist in the case of a drowning. So this is not to be ignored. This is telling us something. But which variable should we monitor to observe or to predict? Because that's what at the beginning of the course I said, that's what we want to be able to do to alleviate uncertainty about the future. So what should we look at? If we had a good relationship with the person selling ice cream, maybe they could give us a call, right, when sales are up and say, you know what, there's a lot of people buying ice cream. Maybe there's going to be more drownings. Or you could think, well, actually, the reason why there's a lot of people buying ice cream is because there's a lot of people on the beach. Or there's a lot of people on the beach because the temperature is high. So now you have a lot of different variables here that could explain the drownings. Which one would you put into an experiment? Let's say we're going to collect data and we were going to call one an explanatory variable and one a response variable. Which one should we make it? Well, this is the response, right? I'm not going to put another arrow. So this is our response variable.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking, and this was just me, actually, if you, just like you said, if you're like the manager of a beach, like control the beach population and monitor, obviously, to get the response, control the beach population and monitor then the amount of drownings.
Okay, let's go one step back. How could you predict the beach population? Can you predict the beach population?
Yeah, different patterns like the temperature.
Yeah, so there's just one step back. So actually, the temperature does influence the beach population. So this could be this can be seen as a causal link that then through from the temperature to the beach population, you see the number of drownings go up. So this is good. I mean, you could monitor the beach population, collect the data, and then get the drownings. But beach population is really dependent on temperature. Now, the beauty of this, so what I'm going to do first is say, let's take this back. So these are lurking, these are behind. Until you call them out, we're going to call these lurking variables. These are the variables we're discussing right now, right? Temperature and beach population. So these are lurking until we name them, and then we actually label one of them the explanatory variable. So in a study, we probably temperature predicts beach population, and both of these will then influence drownings. So these are lurking behind. And if you want to study one of them as explanatory, you could use either of them. The one that's easier, I would think, is for what it's worth, in Puerto Rico, I mean, it's different for Puerto Ricans. You guys think it's cold right now, and the rest of the world, I mean, not now, but it's getting warmer, but I mean in December, right? But the rest of the world thinks it's warm. So maybe it's not temperature, it's more beach population, because it might not have to do with the temperature. It could be holidays that put people on the beach, right? Or culture that puts people on the beach, cultural.
Yeah, but in Puerto Rico, because we are so sensitive to the temperature, we tend to go less when we feel it's cold. So even if you have tourists, maybe it doesn't make up for the amount of people that are at the beach versus
Yes.
if you're in the Northeast or somewhere like that, you're
Yeah.
gonna have a lot more people going in the summer than in the winter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But these are issues to consider, and I'm just being sensitive to that.
Yeah.
It's more about temperature, or it could be that, even that's the thing here. You guys are very sensitive, not just to the temperature, but you're also sensitive to any hazard on the beach. No one's going to go when it's, dangerous or wind or wavy, or, you guys are very smart about that. So anyway, but just saying that when there's a certain time of the year you guys go, right? So it's going to be in Easter, right? You're going to go in June, you're going to go in July, August, September, you're going to go. So there's a certain time. But anyway, so to study this, an explanatory variable could be either temperature or beach population. And you think about it or look at them both, but obviously they are related. So they're related, so you couldn't, you'd study them independently or the relationship between them. So there's a lot to do here. As simple as this it sounds, you could collect information. I just suggest that temperature is something you could actually use to predict, because temperature is measured days to a week before. However good it is, it's measured in advance. Okay, so my point is that once you name one of these explanatory, then it's not exactly a lurking variable. Lurking variable are like the hidden variables. So in the video, they talk about the lurking variable of genetics when it comes to smoking causing cancer. And they call it lurking for the very reason that we can't name it. We don't know exactly, we don't know what gene, we don't know what chromosome, we don't know. Okay, so that's why they use the word lurking, because it's hidden. But once you identify it, it's no longer, we call it explanatory, and we study it. All right, so in terms of experiments, oh, this is interesting too. It's so funny. I've been using these notes, and there's made some edits over the years, but a lot of my notes have become relevant since COVID. So here's another example. You know a lot about how they use rodents in experiments, right? So they'll use rats, mice, guinea pigs. So one reason I think, and honestly, this is just logic for me. Not that I read it anywhere, but it's logical that they use those animals because most people don't have an affinity to those animals. Now, things have changed in the last 20, 30 years. And actually, I think there's some countries that outlawed any experimentation using animals. So that's interesting. It's nice for the animals, but it's kind of bad for the humans, right? Because they have to actually participate in experiments with treatments. So skin treatments, cosmetics are not using, they may get a label that they weren't used, that no animals were used in experiments in that. So that makes safety an issue. That makes whether the trials were done properly or done at all is another issue. But anyway, but barring that, we have used rodents in experiments probably because people don't, it's not like little dogs, puppies. It's not like using puppies in experiments, right? Nobody's going to agree to that. You don't want to use animals that people have a particular affinity to in experiments. So rats and rodents aren't so much. And in fact, I should tell you that they don't just go out and pick rodents off the street, right? They're actually genetically engineered. They engineer them. So they have rats or mice for a particular cancer study. They actually engineer them so that they are either they have cancer, or they breed them in a way so that they're all identical. I don't know that they exactly clone them. I'm not sure about that, but they genetically engineer them that they have the same traits that they're interested in manipulating. So they do quite an elaborate job in making sure that the participants are otherwise, or the subjects of the study are otherwise identical. So another reason why they're going to use rodents is it depends on what they're looking at. So the metabolism of the metabolism is faster in a mouse than in a human, so you can see things in a shorter time span, right? However, when it comes to COVID, the ACE2 receptor that they always talked about that would bind with the spike protein is not the same on mice. And I heard this from a vaccinologist, wrote me about it because I was asking questions. So the studies that were done on mice with the vaccine are irrelevant. They don't have that exact feature that we're interested in is not the same. So that's just saying that why you would pick rodents, it could be argued that it's the right subject to use or it's the wrong, depending on the kind of study you're doing. And my apologies to anyone who loves mice. Mice are okay, I guess. Hamsters are cute, but we've let pharma and the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry get away with using rodents for over a century. Okay, for sampling, opinion polls, labor market surveys. Sampling is conducted when we want to measure certain characteristics in a population or a target population. That's just the one of interest. Proportion of people who favor the Democrats, proportion of defective ball bearing. So these kinds of variables, these kinds of statistics. So proportion is a statistic, right? Proportion, average, these are statistics. We use a symbol X bar for the mean or the average. We use a symbol P for proportion. You're going to see this. Those are statistics. It is usually the case the entire population cannot be sampled since it is prohibitively expensive to do properly. A sample collects observable data in a random fashion when funds are limited. This is better than incomplete coverage of census data. If sampled properly, the sample is representative of the entire population. We study our sample in the hope that it will tell us about the greater population. The greater the size of the sample, the better. And I'm saying that considering that, it's still the quality of the sample is intact, even with the larger size. However, a modest improvement in exactness may not justify the added cost. And there's some other points here. Okay, you don't treat the subjects in a sample. They have to be collected. The observations have to be collected in a random way, not a haphazard way. We'll talk about that. Not everyone is in the sample. I explained that. But you want it to be representative. Sampling is more likely. So although experiments are more likely in the physical and natural sciences, sampling is more frequent in the others: social sciences, economics, sociology, psychology. So in the social sciences, you'll see more sampling than experiments. And these are done in a way not to include bias. And the census in the video we know as the US Census. And the surveys that we saw were the NRC videos, surveys, and the US Census Bureau surveys. I think American data is excellent. It's accessible. It's just, I've studied US Census Bureau data and finished my PhD thesis. I intended to do a study using Canadian data, but it just was not readily available. And it's really great that the US has that database. And it's incredible that not enough, like it's not studied. Maybe it is studied, but not as much as it could be, because I can think of tons of studies I could do if I had time. And it's all publicly available, so that's great. All right, so let's look at experiments. Well, I'm going to describe the elements of an experiment. I'm going to give them names, label them, and then we're going to look at some examples. Okay, so the definitions. Experimental units are the subject that is acted upon. The treatments are the conditions, experimental conditions applied. The response variable is a measurement of how the unit responded or reacted to the treatment. The factors are the explanatory variables. So what we're trying to link to the response. And there's levels of factors. And those levels of factors are the different treatments corresponding to the different levels of the factors. So we begin with a simple experiment of having an individual consume 1 ounce of alcohol and measuring the blood alcohol content after 1 hour. So the question would be, does drinking alcohol affect the blood alcohol level after an hour? So does it dissipate? Is it still there after an hour in your blood? Or does it get into your blood? Does it pass into your blood? How fast? So anyway, there's many questions actually when you begin to think about. So let's see how what I'm going to narrow it down to. So the unit is the individual person consuming the alcohol. The treatment is the alcohol. The response is a measure of the blood alcohol level after 1 hour. The factor is the alcohol, and the level is the amount of alcohol, 1 ounce. And I mentioned you could vary the level and have many levels of alcohol by varying the percentage of alcohol content. So you can create more treatments than just one. All right, so what kind of experiments work? There are 3 R's to experimental design: representation or control. To force it to be an R, I had to make the word representation rather than control. randomization and replication. What we hope to see is a difference that's not just due to chance variation, right? So if there's a difference and we can label it as statistically significant, and like I said, by the end of the course, we'll have some of the tools to do that. It's just the beginning. Once you finish this course, it's just the beginning to exploring statistics. We can use the laws of probability, which give mathematical description of chance behavior to learn if treatment effects are larger than we would expect to see if only chance were operating. If they are, we call them statistically significant. An observed effect is so large that it would rarely occur by chance is called statistically significant. So this is what we're trying to do. What's a large enough effect? That's what we're going to learn, how to establish that amount. Okay, so my second experiment, the first one was the blood alcohol in the blood caused by drinking alcohol. The second is the gastric ulcer freezing experiment. All right, so we're going to begin with representation. So representation, the aim is to control against the effect of lurking variables on the response. Here's the experiment. We're going to see whether this new treatment is going to improve the pain or resolve the pain for someone who's suffering from a stomach ulcer. What we're going to do is we're going to ask them how they feel before applying any treatment. So, I mean, ahead of this, we're going to screen them to make sure that they are safe to try to join the trial. I know there's no obvious risks of them participating. And then once we've decided that they're going to participate, maybe we'll call them at a later date, invite them and tell them that we'll pay for their parking, or we have parking spots assigned that when they come up to the clinic, that things will be easy for them, that the waiting time is not too long. So we reassure them we're not wasting their time, that it's going to be an efficient process. And so they enter into the clinic and they fill in a survey, or they answer some questions, and a nurse or clinical assistant fills in the survey, and they're asked about some demographics, like their age, and then they're asked about their how they feel, their condition, and that level of pain they're suffering. They're moved to another area where they receive the treatment, and the treatment is actually an endoscopic tube is inserted through their throat with an ultrasound to reach the stomach, at which point a solution is administered through this tube, and then the tube is removed as efficiently and quickly as possible. Before the tube is inserted, maybe an anesthetic is applied so the throat isn't made sore by the insertion, or the person feels like they have to cough. And when it's done, the tube is removed, and they're asked to sit in a comfortable position in a waiting room or in a private room. And then they're at some point, and probably this whole procedure, it has to be structured in a way that it's the same for everyone in terms of times in each location. Then they're asked to complete a survey of pain again. And then they're allowed to, they're welcome to leave, of course. Now, when this study is conducted, so this is invented. I didn't actually do this, but it's to make a few points, right? That there's quite an investment of the individual in time and discomfort to participate in this experiment, and maybe the fact that they're there is because they're really suffering, right? So you're attracting sufferers. You're maybe compensating them a bit for the inconvenience of coming out, but you don't want to pay them. You don't want to pay them too much that you're going to attract people who there's an ethical amount, and I don't know right now how it works, but I know that you can't offer too much money for that. And there are limited funds at any rate. Budgets are always tight, no matter where you look. So I just want to make the point that this person has to actually have the ulcer, and that's part of the screening, right? They have to become recommended by a physician who's already assessed the the existence of the ulcer. All right, so let's break it down into the parameters, or the elements of the experiment. We have the person with the ulcer, the treatment of the solution applied to the location of the ulcer to produce the production of acid. And this solution is like a cooling solution, or freezing, right? Ulcer's freezing, so it should cool the area. The response is the self-report level of pain, and the factor is the solution applied, and the level will be the temperature of the solution. As a result of this experiment, several participants were involved, and the results were overwhelmingly positive. What is wrong with this experiment? That is the question for you. I went detail by detail, so I don't have to repeat it in the next part. But what's wrong with this as an experiment?
Yeah, the person answering how they feel can have a lot of, placebo and other effects that are not controlled.
Right. There's no control. We did not put any control in this experiment. There's no control group. Self-report sometimes is all that we have. And I'll tell you right now, any survey analysis or any experiment is not perfect, but it doesn't bar us from doing them. All we have to be sure to do is consider in our writing of a report of experiment or a survey all the limitations of our study and how those limitations may have influenced our outcomes. In this case, we don't even have a control group. So we need to introduce that before saying anything definitive. So I didn't mention, but this study also has to be double blind, right? So the administration, the people at the clinic who are receiving participants, they shouldn't signal or say anything about what the patient is receiving. The best way to ensure that is not to tell them. So all of the tubes and all of the solution bottles, they should all be labeled with numbers, but not any clear labeling that defines them as treatment or control, right? So that's not even in the study above, because there is no control group. But we want this to be double blind, where the staff has no idea, nor the patient, about what's going on. So this could all be prearranged by a pharmacy or by a third-party company that does all the labeling and has a record of patients' IDs and what treatment they received. All right, so let's make this into a proper experiment. So we're going to have the person screened that they actually have an ulcer. We're going to give them a treatment that's the cold solution applied to the ulcer. We're going to record the response. So everything's the same so far, right? The factor is the solution applied. What changes is this, the level of the factor. We're going to introduce two types of temperatures, the cold temperature of the treatment to the treatment group, and we're going to just put a lukewarm or body temperature liquid or like water or benign, saline for the control group. In this case, conducting this experiment, we see no, this does not have a significant effect on outcomes. So what we saw in the study above was just people feeling attended to, feeling better. They got out of the house, they got some attention, they got to complain about their ulcer, and they had this invasive treatment to do it. So it has to work, right? It must work. I feel better. That's what happens. All right, so that's my second experiment. Any comments? What I'm going to do is ask you a few questions, and then we're going to take about 5 minutes break because I haven't taken a break. So we're going to break for 5 minutes. But here's my question about the physician health study in the video to study aspirin, the effect of aspirin on reducing the risk of dying by heart attack. Why did they use males for the study, and why did they use physicians? Why didn't they just use anybody? So think about that, and let's take 5 minutes. Let's come back. Well, let's just take 10. Let's take 10 minutes and come back at 11.
Okay.
I'm going to pause the video, but remind me to start the recording again, because I made the mistake many times of forgetting. So I'm going to pause the video. Okay, so I had a question for you. Why did they only study male physicians?
I'm guessing to avoid confounding. If you add more variables, then it's harder to tell if it's due to being male versus female or being another type of career that has a different level of stress.
Exactly. Yes. So for for this study, they had almost 22,000 participants. So they figured out they needed 22,000 to draw meaningful conclusions. And that was because in the age group that they were looking at, because they had to be working physicians. So in the age group they were looking at, they a heart attack was, you want to observe a heart attack, but you're not going to observe a heart attack as easily as you'd like, right? So you have to have enough participants so you can observe enough heart attacks to begin with, and then to observe a difference in the number of heart attacks. Okay, so for the rates of heart attacks that I can't remember right now, I used to know that number, but I can't remember if it was 1 in 1,000 or anyway, but this was enough. The point is that it was enough to be able to see heart attacks over the period of time that they were looking. So they engaged physicians with intentions to have them for up to 10 years, but they were able to see the results in about half that time. All right. So you want enough participants so that you can observe a change. And then you have to think about the cost. For every participant, there's a cost. You need to record data on them. There's data entry costs. You have to have the aspirins for them. You have to have the staff to take their vitals and do a complete physical on them routinely. I'm not sure if it was every year or every 6 months. And you want to keep, as much as you want to have a high enough number to observe heart attacks, in this population, you also want to keep the costs down. And the way you're going to do that is making sure that these treatment groups, so here they are, the treatment groups, there's 4 of them that I'm going to explain. You want enough in each group. So you want about the same amount in each group. So with 22,000 divided by 4, there would be about 5,000 in each group. And among those 5,000, you have to be able to observe enough heart attacks and a change or a difference between treatment and control group. Now, for this study, thinking about heart attacks, what are the risk factors for heart attacks?
High cholesterol diet,
Right. So now you start thinking it has,
high pressure,
yeah, blood pressure,
stress. Oh, yeah, Patricia Leon.
stress. Yeah. Right. Yeah. You guys are all making good points here. Okay. So stress, diet, income, education, exercise. So basically, lifestyle and income are huge risk factors, right? Or predictors. And then also genetics. So those and that knowledge base, income, they may vary between doctors, right? Because you have all kinds of different doctors. You have and you have a range of lifestyles, but it's less volatile or less variable, right? They're more likely to be the same between each other than they are with the rest of the population. So that's probably, this is why they picked physicians. Oh, and somebody mentioned that someone mentioned that the interest and willingness to comply and to remain in the study. Oh, one other thing. Okay, so these are risk factors for heart attack. Another point is, let me add, that's one thing. 2 is compliance and interest in results for their patients, for their practice, for their families. And the 3rd is tracking. That from involving a physician in a study, that physician, you're gonna follow them longitudinally. Well, physicians are licensed and physicians are registered, and you can find them if they fall out of the study or you lose track with them. You can find out if they died pretty easily, right? It's not like just anybody. So So those are some of the reasons. And I didn't get to the point about male. The fact that they're male, it's not to rule out women, but the fact that they're male, they're at higher risk, right? And it's more of an urgent thing to find out for males, but at any rate, you could draw conclusions for the general population from the males, and if you want, you can do subsequent studies to see the effect on women. But I hope you guys can read my writing, my printing. Let me know if there's any questions you have. So these are the reasons why they used male physicians. All right, let's look at the study and how it was conducted, because it wasn't mentioned that they also studied beta carotene and its preventive effect on reducing the risk of cancer or cancer death.
Yeah, the response variable here is very ample because it just says death and cause of death. So if you had a heart attack and you survive,
It's not here.
it's not there, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so let's go through.
Even if you had cancer and did not die.
Right. Right. And so let's go through the elements of the features of this experiment. So again, the subject is the participant, which is a male physician. The treatments, there are 4 because they introduced 2 factors now, aspirin and beta carotene. Aspirin to prevent death by heart attack, and beta carotene to prevent death by cancer. Now, clearly, these were determined not to be confounding factors, right? It's to be able to attribute the effect to one of the treatments. These shouldn't be affecting the person in any way. So that must be an assumption here. So then the first factor is aspirin, and there's a group that got the aspirin and a group that didn't. So this group of people, so 10,000 people, because there's 5,000 in each, got the aspirin and 10,000 did not. And they were also randomized according to beta carotene. And I'm going to talk about the randomization in a second. So this column were the participants who received the beta carotene, and this one didn't. So in these notes, I'm using the symbol placebo. I don't know. Yeah, it's all here. Okay, so these ones got, this group got both in placebo, these got both the actual treatment. All right, let's talk about the randomization. So how does the randomization take place? So what we're going to do is invite participants into this study. So physicians among themselves, probably it was easy to get them because in their weekly or monthly newsletters, they were invited, and in their medical journals, they were invited to participate. So they signed up to participate and they were labeled. So they were labeled so what would be the labels? What would they look like? The numerical labels. Let me look at the thing. So how would the labels look? Well, the last label would have the number. So if I had all the labels in, the last one would be 21996. So the first one has to have the same label, right? Same digits, number of digits, but we can label it 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 2, 0, 0, 0, 0, 3, etc. And then using a random digits generator, it will tell us some numbers. It will tell us pick candidate or participant 0.01056, and that person you would put in here. And then the next one that comes up, 22005, you put in the next one. And then the next one, oh, that's too big. That doesn't exist. I got to do that again. That's too big. I make it 22005, 20005. And what about 00013 and 01029? Okay, so an example, and then you would keep going.
Well, ideally, you would use a randomization algorithm, right, to do that.
You use a random digits table or a random digits generator. Yeah, so I'm not making up these numbers. I'm getting them from a generator.
Yeah.
I'm showing you they're coming from here. Right. And so all of the doctors are assigned to a different treatment group, and there's about 5,000 in each. And then what I hope for is among the 5,000, some of them have high blood pressure, some of them have low blood pressure, and there's just as many in each of the groups. Some of them have high stress, some of them have low stress, and there's a little bit of them in each group. So there's no systematic bias of any of these factors in any of the groups. So then the only difference will be the treatment. Okay, so what did we find? Oh, I covered up my statement here. So we found that in the end, comparing this group of 10,000 against this group of 10,000, after 5 or so years, 239 of the placebo group died of heart attack, and 139 of the aspirin group died of heart attack. And this was enough, this extra 100, extra almost 50%. Well, it's 100% higher, right? This is about, well, anyway, it's 100 more than 139. So this was enough to determine a significant impact, a significant, statistically significant difference. Now, just looking at the numbers, you would know that. We could talk about the numbers, but there's actually probability models that will help us determine that that's more unusual than just a chance occurrence. And this was enough to say this was significant evidence to support the claim that aspirin reduces the incidence of heart attack. In terms of cancer, there was no significant evidence to support that beta carotene, when they compared these 10,000 against these 10,000, that it reduced the incidence of cancer or cancer death. Any questions? So through a control for the placebo effect, the only difference in the experimental design is the content of the pill, not these characteristics. So besides unveiling how this experiment was done, this is also an opportunity to see a two-factor design. We created from 2 factors and 2 levels, we created 4 treatments. All right, so now you're going to see how this works. You can see the matrix here. To compute the number of treatments, you take the number of levels of factor 1 times the number of levels of factor 2, and so on. Control ensures that any difference that we find in response is attributable only to the treatment. The logic is that since the groups are virtually the same, There cannot be another cause. That is, the result of reducing heart attack is not attributable to any group characteristic. So they're systematically the same here in a broader sense. All right, so I'm going to give you this example here and give you a moment to identify how many treatments in this experiment. Now, this experiment is about making bread. Not about people. So how does that affect things? So try that. Any answers?
The factors are 3.
Okay, let's read through it. Okay, and then treatments
18.
and response.
4.
Okay, good. All right, so that's correct. So a food scientist is planning to conduct an experiment to investigate the effects of different agents, redox agents, different types of flour, and different dough methods. So those are the 3 factors. And each of these agents have different levels, right? So there's 3 redox agents. These are the levels.
Mhm.
Right? So those are the levels. So to get the treatments, you need to cross 3 times 3 times 2 equals 18. And then in terms of what they're going to measure once they're done, flavor, volume, density, and crumbs texture. So that is 4. All right, so what I want you to do next, so does anybody have questions? What I want you to do next is draw them, just like I did up here, into a factor design. I want you to draw the 18 treatments. What would that look like?
Would be a cube, right?
Let me think, not exactly a cube. Trying to think of the cube.
Yeah, because we have 3 levels.
Right. But it's not 3 times 3 times 3. It would be a cube if it was 3 times 3 by 3, but it's you can make it. Well, anyway, let me give some time. Let me give some time. You guys think about it, and then I'll show you. So you could say there are 2 mixing methods. So we could say method. Let me do this again. It's too small. So for the first mixing method, I could have the redox agent and the type of flour that would be for method 1, but then I can repeat it for method 2. So it's 9 and then 9 more. I'm hoping I can do this. And here you see your 9, but this is method 2 here. So it could be a cube if you had 3 by 3 by 3. Got it? So
Yes.
it's important for you to be able to visualize and see. I'm doing the same thing I did here, and then this would be method 1, agent 1, flour 1, and probably need to make more than just 1 loaf of bread, don't you think? Maybe there's other factors that we need to control against. Maybe the temperature in the room, like other things that could affect the flour. The consistent temperature of the oven, that can change. So you maybe want to make 5 loaves in each of these. Questions, comments?
The loads would be how many replicates do we want to do?
I'm not saying an exact number, but you should replicate, right? Because there might be things you didn't think about, or something could happen. Because what affects a loaf, it would be the consistent temperature. You'd have to be using the same pans for all of these different loaves. But from loaf to loaf, there might be slight things that vary that affect the responses that you're interested in. And anyone who's a baker will understand that. Or like an average baker, because average bakers, you know, from cake or pie to cookies, and trying to repeat recipes, they come out different every time. And that's for variables that you haven't really pinned down, either about your oven or the consistency of the temperature or letting it preheat long enough, or anyway. So there's just different things like that. So just the point is just to make a few different loaves. Okay, so that's about control. Oh, and I have one other thing to say here. We did not have a control group here because this was not a human subject experiment, right? But we are controlling as much as we can for factors we believe influence the response measurements of the loaf once it's made. So there's no control group because this is not a human subject experiment. It's not in the strict sense of the placebo group. We don't have one. We don't need one. The loaves are not thinking. Although some people would argue or say that live things do communicate, but anyway, I'm not going to get into that here. Living things like the yeast in the bread communicates with the other yeast and the other loaves. But no, we're not going to get into that. So there's not a consciousness here, we assume. Okay, randomization. Let's talk about that. Random means that no one subject has a greater chance of being allocated to one treatment versus another. The issue behind randomization in experiments is to ensure that there is nothing systematic in the way that subjects are allocated to treatments. In this way, if a difference in responses is observed, it can reasonably be considered the effect of the treatment and not individual differences between groups. So this is really important in experiments in human subjects for experimental treatment, for rare diseases or for life-threatening diseases, terminal diseases, because there could be a tendency for the research staff to want to include the most serious cases or include their patient that they have a certain, affection for or concern about to include them in experience. You don't want that to happen, not because you don't want to be indifferent to your patients, but it's really going to wreck the validity of the results. So you need a completely randomized design to ensure that all the experimental units are allocated at random. This is not haphazard, okay? It means that there is a specific way to do it. It's not just, made up. or non-specific. So you review in the videos, if you've seen them, how to proceed to select subjects from a list of candidates for an experiment. So here's an example. Here are the volunteers that have come to participate, and we want to label them, and we're told to begin with labeling with 1. So we only need 1 digit because the last one only has 1 digit. So the first one only has 1 digit. I tell you 1 rather than 0 because technically you could use just the number 0 and start from there, but this is more intuitive to start labeling the first, second, third, etc. participant. All right, so then we're going to select using these tables that were generated in a random way. There are 10 possible digits, right? The digits are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which makes 10 because you have the 0. So because of the 0, that's why here I was saying I could have put a 0 because 0 is just as likely as any other number here. So there's 10 possible numbers for each selection. So this was chosen from this list in a random way, either from, like they show in the video, picking from a hat. Well, virtually a computer can be programmed to do that, like picking from a hat. And then each time that number is chosen, it's returned to the hat, and then another draw is made, and then a 5 turns out. Okay, so I'm going to select my sample of 4 by working through the numerical list. And in fact, the first digit is not in my list, so I ignore it. The next digit is. So 5 is chosen, Rodriguez. 9 is not in the list. 0 is not on the list. 7 is in the list, so I choose Tulane. 5 has already been chosen. I don't choose 5 again, all right? Because this is going to be a medical trial, it's just, I want to, I don't allow Rodriguez to be chosen again. Now, mathematically, it's showing up, but I'm going to skip it because he's just not eligible because he already had the treatment, and that will affect his reaction or his response or his impression. Anyway, it's just not a good idea. All right, so 0 is out because it's not in our list. 4 is next, Munoz. 9, it does not come in our list. 5 has already been excluded, and then 1, Castro. So those are the 4 that will go into, 1 second, into the treatment group. Sorry, I keep missing the chat because I'm turning in a different direction. Maybe I'll turn my iPad towards the screen. So yeah, Brenda mentioned about the loaves of bread that altitude can affect. So she's a baker. She's a baker. She knows these things. My recipes do not turn out the same in Puerto Rico as they do in Canada. Humidity is just so high here, and there it's just so low. It's dramatic opposite. All right, so then that will be Castro Munoz. So then B is the answer here. Any questions? That's easy, straightforward. All right, so what I want to do next is a different type of experiment to just make the case about how randomization is conducted. We are going to investigate the best way to promote energy conservation. And we suspect that feedback, biofeedback might be a way, I don't know if we call it biofeedback, but some sort of feedback to the participant households about their use may help. So we're going to employ two methods, two treatments to see which one is better, and we're going to compare them and compare them against a control group. Why do we have a control group here?
These people that are making the decisions on the electricity.
Say it again, sorry?
Because these people, the behaviors, so people are making the decisions.
Yeah, so people's behavior may change because they know they're being watched, and it might have nothing to do with the method. We really want to test the method. We like people to change their behaviors, but we need to know if the method is doing it, not the observation of them doing it. Because after the experiment's over, we hope they continue with those behaviors, right? So this is, you can see this is tricky, right? Trying to change behaviors is very tricky because at any rate, they're being monitored, and that could be a key factor. So we're going to try and control against them changing behaviors because they're being monitored and because they are empathetic to the cause. They want to reduce energy use. Also, energy is much more expensive, and they're being called upon to be part of an experiment that looks at promoting energy conservation. So they're aware and they might be interested, because why would they say yes to be participants if they could care less? All these people care, right? They're invested in the results. So what we're going to do is create a control group. We're going to try and find 60 households to participate. So our total N, small N, represents sample size, is I think I mentioned this the first class, but big N is the population size, the number of elements. So with a sample size of 60, what we're going to do is label them. And what will the labels look like? Well, the last one has to be 60. So the first one has to be 01, 02, 03, etc. And using a number generator, we're going to take the first 20 and put them in group 1, or we're going to just keep rotating through the groups. Either way is fine. And so we're going to randomly assign 20 to group 1, 20 to group 2, and 20 to group 3. And then they'll be informed. They know they're part of this experiment. They'll be informed once the randomization, once enough households are identified, and once randomization is completed, they will be informed by a research staff member about what to do. So each of them have to be told virtually the same thing. They have to be treated the same way, except group 1 gets to know that their meter, their electricity meter, will be monitored on a random basis. Treatment 2 is a little more interactive, because they'll be told that they'll be instructed, they'll be taught how to fill in their electricity usage onto a chart. They can do it on their computer, they can log in, or they can do it on a sheet of paper. And they monitor and observe the change in their use according to the meter. So this is a step beyond. This is more interactive, and probably likely to get more of a result in behavior than having someone randomly show up and read your meter. They'll also be told that their meter will be read randomly, right? So they can have otherwise exactly the same treatment. And the control group will also be told that they will be visited and informed at a later date, but they're not going to get any random visits. They're not going to be told about random visits. Okay, so they don't get anything. So what's going to happen? I guess this one can have a meter reading, or else that'll be confounded. So these guys will be told, the treatment one will be told the meter will be read randomly. Treatment 2 group will be told they have to record the meter reading, and treatment 3, well, they'll be told that they'll be informed at a later date, but they don't otherwise do anything. That's the best way to make sure that these treatments are separated. And then you compare the electricity use from beginning to end. And you'll see that just because they're part of the experiment, the control group will show that there's a reduction in energy use. The other 2 methods have to reduce energy use by more. Otherwise, this study will not have a significant, will not lead to a significant difference or a statistically significant result. Okay, any questions about that? All right, so the 3 R's are random representation through control, randomization, which we've discussed, and replication. Replication is like the loaf experiment, like any of these experiments we've discussed, there being more than one participant in each group. And in general, the larger the groups, the better it is to establish systematic differences between the treatments. However, there's a cost to doing that. So to do this efficiently, you want to include a lot, but not more than you need. So coming up with that number is also a statistical sophisticated. There's a statistical way to do that, to determine how many participants you actually need. All right, so some of these things I've already said about experiments and why you wouldn't want to just choose rats that are running about, because that will introduce a bias, right? You have a bias because if you can just run around catching rats, they might not be the healthiest rats out there, and that might introduce bias to your study, where if you're testing something that, like a medical intervention, it might not be that successful if you expose these rats to carcinogens and see if your treatment that you have prevents them from dying of cancer, and that they're more likely to die because they're not the healthiest rats. That's a lurking variable. So it could bias downward the study results. So as I was saying, that in study design, you want to be sure that the experimental conditions can be replicated in the real world. And to do that, to make the experiment truly generalizable to a larger scale or to the general population, you need to first conduct some smaller versions of the study to get out the kinks, right? So a pilot project can be done. Just a smaller version of the larger project. And you do the same thing in agriculture. And you just got to be careful because experimental conditions are not the same as exposing crops to the natural elements.
Excuse me, on the previous one, it says bias upward, downward, or unclear. So would the unclear just mean that we can tell if there's any bias at all?
Well, it's likely it's going to be downward bias results, because if they're unhealthy.
No, I'm not talking about a specific example. I'm talking about in general. Why
Yeah.
the two options? So what would the third option apply for?
if it's just not clear, because I was able to say it's the health of rats. Well, I mean, I have to come up with a new example, but unclear that you couldn't know either way. If you, in this example, I've just said the health of rats, but you could say that, I don't know, I can't make it up right now. Because I've already entered this, but if I wrote something else, it could be indeterminate. You
But
don't
here
know.
it's hard to relate the variable with a bias side.
Unclear.
Okay.
Yeah. Depends what you wrote here. Okay, now I'm thinking about it. But okay, thanks for the question. All right, so another problem, another challenge is during an experiment, the experiment is being carried out with the instructions from and the routine monitoring of the scientific staff, right? The research staff. What happens if you remove them? Things may just not in the real world look like they did in experimental conditions. So let's say you study something like Alzheimer's medication, but you do it in a home, like you do it under conditions where the participants, the patients are actually in a care home and their medication is being administered to them. Well, that's different than having somebody at home in their own home with their family caring for them and ensuring that they're getting their medications on time. No, not trying to anyway, I'm using specifically the Alzheimer's medication because that's aligned with, forgetting. So if you leave an independent patient that lives on their own and insists on living on their own, but they have some dementia problems, they're probably going to be unlikely to take their medication, right? So that's not going to have the same results. So that's an extreme example, but you can think of others. There's some arguments that sweeteners like aspartame, and then there's other names that are used in place of aspartame, but they're pretty much the same thing, that toxicity studies with aspartame were really bad and they were kind of ignored, and it's argued that, well, people will not consume that much aspartame, so you can't take the results of rats as implications for the general public. But then again, people could argue, why not, right? Same thing happened with the COVID vaccine. There were some toxicity studies done on the COVID vaccine, and some of the results were dismissed as not applicable when they're perfectly in terms. Well, I mean, I've listened to different things about what the meaning of those toxicity studies are. They're giving large doses, but it's really important to see where they talk about the nano, oh my goodness, I'm slipping my mind, but the sleeve in which envelops the mRNA, that it's seen in all parts of the body and it's not supposed to be like that. But then there's arguments that, oh, well, that it's a toxicity study, that's not relevant, but it's still controversial. Just like this aspartame studies and others like it, toxicity is really important to monitor, but they're not. They need to be monitored. It needs to be monitored and it needs to be followed. And without follow-up, you'll just not know. So, lots to say about pharma, and that's a course in itself. So I wanted just to say in conclusion about what we've learned so far and what we saw on the cancer side and smoking causing cancer without an actual experiment. The Surgeon General was able to say in the 60s that smoking causes cancer without that experiment. And how did he pull that off? And I have here in the annotated notes, it was as a result of like 6,000 studies over 40 years that all showed basically the same thing. That's how he made the argument. And the studies were done worldwide to make the same case. And it still took another 40 years for the smoking, secondhand smoke, to be restricted or prevented on the general public. So these things take a long time, and unfortunately, there is an incentive by
So,
by industry to protect their products. Sorry,
so what did the studies include? You know,
which one? The 6,000 or the?
Yeah, the 6,000 in general, what did they include?
Oh, they were prospective and retrospective studies, experiments on animal tissue, showing the same strong correlation between cigarette smoke and lung cancer. And this was sufficient to make a statement. I'm just reading my comment there, but that's what they say in the video. But it was 6,000 studies over 40 years, observational and experimental. But the experiments were not conducted in the sense of the gold standard comparative randomized experiment. So that's why the tobacco industry created some, for the 40 years following, they were able to create some like a little bit of fog or uncertainty about things, because they'd say, well, it could be, what they said in the video is, they said, well, it could be genetic. It could just be that people who like to smoke also are more prone to cancer. That's the argument they used. And they said it's genetic and it has nothing to do with cigarettes. And people who love smoking felt confident and just didn't stop. I'm surprised. I'm still surprised when I see people smoke, but I understand it becomes a habit, and it's a lifestyle too. And but it's pretty definitive that it's associated carcinogen. And so are these vape, the vape. Any innovation, it just takes a matter of time, unfortunately, and studies or observation on the general public with subsequent experiments to show impact, so yeah, I'm always cautious about innovations myself, because I know these things. All right, so we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do, so I don't have that many notes. What I'm going to ask you to do, because I've talked a lot, I want to start next week clearly with module 3. So I'm going to ask you to watch the videos. I have videos, or old videos. I'm going to mark in the old videos where you should start from here, and you can finish this way. You can finish off module 1. Is that okay? I mean, module 2. So I mostly said all of this stuff. What you have at the end is a question, like on page 23, I have a quiz, and then I have a practice assignment for you and it answers. So we don't have that many pages to go, really. Is that okay? So next week we can begin with any questions you have about this material. You can send in your quiz, the assignment that I posted in Connect, and it will be automatically graded. You can continue to study in module 2, but next week I want to clearly start module 3. I'll send an email about this too, so that everybody who wasn't here will know. How does that sound?
Excuse me, Professor. I submitted the quiz or the homework on Connect, but it displays that the instructor has not chosen to reveal the scores yet.
Yeah, until the time is over.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay.
So if you want to change your answers, you can change them. I think you should be able to change them. Let me know if you cannot. You should be able to re-enter if you want to change anything. The settings Connect changed a few things, so I always get surprised. All right, so this is a good turnout. Most of you are here as far as I can see. And so I will fill your asistencia, and anyone who needs to let me know that they have reviewed the modules, just let me know. So you'll see it, you should be able to see your asistencia, and you can clear your asistencia by notifying me if you're not here. Okay,
Yeah,
so
the-
I will
the-
post, I will mark on the platform where you can start to complete the review of this module, but I'm confident that the old video will cover the rest.
Yeah, the quizzes timeline is until what, 11:59 of the day when it's supposed to be like the last day?
Yeah, what day did I make it? I made it, hold on, I made it
Tuesday.
Tuesday night.
I'm not sure. I know it's
You have to
Tuesday.
check. Does anybody remember? I think I said May 2nd. Yeah, Tuesday night,
Yeah.
midnight. Is that good enough?
Yeah. well,
It's a very short. I'm going to go in now to make sure that I have unlimited attempts, so you can just go through and try it, and then if there's anything that's bothering you, you can change it later. But at this point, you should be able to answer the quiz.
Okay.
Okay. So buenas tardes. Have a good weekend and week. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Natalia,
Buenas tardes, bye.
Bye. Gracias.
Professor,
Yes,
could I stay to ask you a question?
sure. Let me turn off the recording.